Hello everyone, and welcome to our third lecture of Chapter 18 here, where of course we're overviewing the endocrine system. As you can see in this lecture, we're going to break it down into three different parts here. We're going to focus heavily on the thyroid gland. It's going to actually take us 2 parts to really break down the thyroid gland, because as you can see, we're actually going to get into a huge physiological process on the entire formation of thyroid hormone. So we're going to see that, and then we'll finish with the adrenal gland. And overall, Lecture 3 has a lot of great testing material. It makes up the bulk of pretty much this unit here, and has a lot of key concepts that I focus on and test really heavily on. So prepare yourself. We're going to continue to build off of what we've learned in the past, but we're going to continue moving forward and adding more details to things, and just the expectations and what you should be able to retain is continuing to be increased as we progress in these lectures here. Alright, like usual, you can see my various objectives. You can see part 1, we're really breaking down the thyroid, and then part 2, we really get into some specific details, and then you can see by part 3, we're in the adrenal gland. If you really wanted to read up on these objectives, feel free to pause it here, but I am going to move on, and our focus, of course, is going to be on this first part. As usual, my first part of each lecture, so this is the beginning of Lecture 3, Part 1 here, we'll begin with giving you the citation of the book we use, which of course we're following along with Pearson along their Fundamentals of Anatomy and Physiology, 11th edition by Martini, Nath, and Bartholomew there. Alright, let's get into the lecture. And so when we begin, we start off with the thyroid gland, and you certainly should be able to recognize that it's sitting right here. It's pretty much in our throat region. If you notice, this is going to be our neck veins and neck arteries here. And so it sits right in between there, and so it's really right in our throat region. And so you can see inferior to the thyroid cartilage, which is the Adam's apple of the larynx. Everyone has the thyroid cartilage. It's just more prominent in males, which is why it gets the name Adam's apple. It just tends to stand out and be more noticeable for males. You should know there's 2 lobes. It's technically connected by the isthmus region. This term comes up a few times in anatomy, so I kind of mention it, but it's pretty rare that I really even label that up. You should just be familiar with that terminology. All right, but when we get into the anatomy, you really need to know that this is composed of something called thyroid follicles, and that's what we're seeing here. Each of these spherical objects is a thyroid follicle, and think of this as a 3D image, so this would be coming towards you. It would almost form a ball or a sac that gets filled with fluid, as you can see here. And hands down, I expect my students to know that if I gave you a sort of histology image that looks like this, I would ask you, what kind of organ does this represent? Obviously, this pinkish color and kind of this pinkish fluid is a giveaway that it's the thyroid gland. And I often ask, what type of epithelial tissue is this organ composed of? And as you can see, it's simple cuboidal. So that is definitely on the lab side of things, but certainly on a lecture exam, it's not hard for anatomical description, asking something like, the thyroid gland is composed of which of the following types of epithelium? Well, simple cuboidal. All right. So hands down, you need to know that. In those spheres, you should note they get filled with a fluid, and that fluid is called a colloid. And so you can see here's follicle cavities here, thyroid globulin stored in the colloid of the follicle. So the colloid is the fluid, all right, and it's filled with something called TGB, or thyroid globulin. So definitely a term you should know. This is the protein precursor that ultimately leads to the production of thyroid hormone that gets produced by follicle cells. And so we're going to see this later on. This is one of the parts that gets produced, but there's an important ion that needs to be added to this structure here. So the cells will produce thyroid globulin, TGB, and that's what ends up getting shipped and stored into this thyroid follicle. So you should know, again, things that I label, can you identify this as the thyroid gland? Do you know it's simple cuboidal epithelium? Now, if I point to the center area, do you know that this is the colloid? That's the pink solution, okay? And then often I might ask, what is found in that pink solution? That would be thyroid globulin. The solution itself is the colloid, okay? And so we'll be explaining and breaking this down in more details in a little bit here. All right, but cells surrounded by capillaries are going to deliver and receive nutrients, hormones, and waste. And if you notice on here, here's a capillary right here. And I know that because it's simple squamous epithelium, this kind of flattened nuclei. So there we have a capillary here. You kind of have a capillary down here. And so nutrients and stuff are going to be brought to this area, and the hormone itself can exit using these capillaries in here, and so that's going to be the exchange site. So you can see this epithelium has lots of vasculature surrounding it, so the gland is full of plenty of blood vessels to basically transport those ingredients. So A lot of anatomical description here. This is the basic parts that you really want to make sure you're getting down early in this lecture, especially since we're just beginning lecture 3 now. Get the key terminology down, the key anatomical description, and the key histology down as we move along here. All right, so we're going to jump right into the histology here, and the things that you need to be able to do is, if I throw anything that looks very similar to this, you need to be able to recognize it as the thyroid gland. I often ask on usually the first question when I throw up a slide like this, I would just simply ask, what's the main organ represented in these figures? Or maybe it's just one of the figures. Nothing looks like this. Nothing has these pinkish or purplish filled spheres. That is hands down a thyroid gland histology image. Nothing else has this pinkish shape. Okay. Again, I do lab lectures. You should listen to lab lectures because I summarize all the lab stuff one after another, and you really get to see the histology compared side by side. All right, but the other things you're going to have to do on here is you're going to have to spot something called the C cell versus the follicle cell. So notice these cells here that form the actual follicle, and a follicle is usually a spherical ball almost. We'll see ovarian follicles are going to have a very similar design like this, but anything that forms these spheres are going to actually be the follicle cells. Okay, and so you should be able to recognize those. Now, there are cells called C cells. They're going to produce a different hormone. They're going to produce something called calcitonin, and we're going to get to that a little bit later. But notice these kind of cells that are a bit larger with a bigger cytoplasm, those are the C cells. So we got a collection of C cells in this area because there's no follicle around there. You got a collection of C cells that I could kind of single out over here, a collection of C cells that I can single out over here. So ultimately on here, you need to know those two cell types. You need to know the hormones released. So the follicular cells are going to produce TGB and secrete the thyroid hormone. So you can put thyroid hormone or the hormones T3, T4, because that's what thyroid hormones are abbreviated as. And then the C cells, they're going to secrete something called calcitonin. All right, can you identify the colloid, and do you know it's stored in the colloid? Again, TGB is in the colloid. So this figure here gets pretty much reviewed on the lab lecture. If you want to see them side by side, that's what you need to be aware of. I like introducing this stuff early in lectures so students are aware, hey, there is lab components. We are going to have a lab exam, and this is really following along with the lab exam, but don't be surprised if you see this on a quiz and see images like this on the exam that I ask you to identify those things as well, because that is certainly fair game for me to do. All right, but before we get into actually thyroid hormone, what's going to stimulate its release? And now I'm asking this question because you should know the answer. What causes thyroid hormone to start releasing T3 or T4? Well, what was our previous lecture on? Well, it was on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. What was that pituitary hormone that stimulated the release of thyroid hormone? Well, hopefully you remember it was thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. So here we're looking at kind of the feedback loop here that we tend to see here. So notice decreased T3 and T4 concentrations in the blood, or even low body temperature. So notice that's what's going to stimulate the initial release of thyrotropic releasing hormone. And so TRH gets released, targets the pituitary gland. That's going to stimulate the release of TSH. That's really where our focus is right there. So notice we have the pituitary peptide hormone stimulates iodine absorption, which we'll see in a little bit. We're going to talk about thyroid formation, but the main point is it's going to stimulate T3 and T4 production and secretion. So that's really your main point. If this iodine absorption kind of throws you off a little bit, you can scratch it out for now. It is an important detail to when we discuss the formation of T3 and T4, but for now, really, if you think of TSH, big picture wise, TSH targets the thyroid hormone when T3 and T4 levels are low, to stimulate the thyroid hormone to release T3 and T4. I'll say that one more time because that really summarizes the impact and what stimulates essentially the release of these hormones. So when T3 and T4 levels are low, TSH will be secreted by the anterior pituitary. That anterior pituitary hormone of TSH will end up circulating in the blood and reaching the thyroid gland. When it reaches the thyroid gland, it will bind to it. It'll stimulate the thyroid gland to produce and release T3 and T4. Now, when T3 and T4 levels in the blood rise, that brings us back to our normal concentrations, and this feedback loop stops. We stop releasing T3 and T4, or we're back to homeostasis, and so T3 and T4 levels will continue to be maintained in their normal concentration. So remember, really we're dealing with concentrations here, and so this was saying we had low levels of T3 and T4. Once we're back into the normal range, the thyroid gland will keep producing it at its normal rate. And so just so it's crystal clear, it's released when T3 and T4 are below a normal range. Again, everything's about a range when we're dealing with this. That's what's going to kind of stimulate the gland to kind of become more active is when low levels of T3 or T4 end up occurring. All right, but overall, when we have low levels of T3 and T4 or even low levels of TSH, this can result in mental and physical sluggishness. This whole entire cascade, the effects of TRH, which is not something I stress too much, you should know this, but really understanding TSH levels correspond to releasing T3 and T4 levels, understand how they are linked. When T3 and T4 are low, we would expect TSH levels to rise. That will cause an increase in the release of T3 and T4 and get us back to balance. All right. In children, the other thing you should understand about this cascade, especially thyroid hormone, it is super important for normal development. I tend to stress the thyroid hormone, but again, anything that interferes with this cascade would ultimately impact normal development. But the point is, thyroid-related hormones are going to impact development, especially for the skeletal, the muscular, and the nervous systems here. All right, I pose a question, and we're going to see this with one of the activities that I hand out in my class. Basically, you're going to see that there's this reading where TSH levels are really high in the blood, but levels of T3 and T4 continue to remain low. What would that indicate? So I would encourage those of you listening to this lecture in general, just pause the video and think about what this question is asking. I'm going to, of course, move ahead because I don't have to delay this. So what this would end up indicating is the TSH receptor, there's an issue there. All right, so TSH receptor issue, so thyroid stimulating hormone on the thyroid gland, because it's a receptor, right? So TSH receptor would be on the thyroid gland itself, which means the thyroid gland is not responding to TSH. So it's something like that. Thyroid's not responding to TSH, or the receptors are issues. Basically, there's a faulty signaling going on, and the thyroid gland is not receiving the message of TSH. Okay, so just think about that. That's just something you should kind of be able to tie, because that's where we're heading with a lot of this unit moving forward. Okay, like you need to be able to critically think about what sort of issue this would indicate. All right, so thyroid hormone, what are its targets? Let's talk about thyroid hormone. And so you're going to see Pearson does excellent tables here. You can see T3 and T4. Do I expect you to know thyroxine and triiodothyronine? I don't really expect you to know those. Those are usually extra credit related. I usually write them as T3 and T4 on the exam. But notice, targets most cells. What's its function? Increase energy utilization, oxygen consumption, growth, and development, stimulated by TSH from the end. So that's everything that we just basically covered. All right. Targets most cells. Notice it binds intracellular receptors. So keep in mind your thyroid hormone is lipid soluble. It is a tyrosine derivative hormone, but it is a lipid soluble tyrosine derivative. Notice, reminding you of the categorization. You need to be able to categorize these hormones appropriately, and therefore, since this is a lipid-soluble substance, it binds intracellular receptors. Hopefully you know intracellular versus extracellular. These are all concepts that we've already discussed. All right, but the functions are all related to energy usage. So notice energy usage or metabolism in some tissues. Basically, that means processing lipids, carbs, and proteins, using them when appropriate, and building up molecules or breaking them down. All right, regulation of body temperature is another important one, and then the growth and development, especially for children. These are the major points. If I mention any of these 3 points as you see it here, you should be thinking thyroid hormone. There's no other hormone that I'm going to mention that really regulates body temperature as specifically as thyroid hormone does. These are the big picture functions. Now, certainly there are secondary functions and there are things and minor details that other hormones might do. We're looking at the big picture, so keep that in mind when we're covering this chapter. Their hormones do a lot of various things. We're focused strictly on the big picture stuff right now. All right, what's the important element for this formation? You might know this answer, and so I'm just posing that question. What's the important element for forming thyroid hormone? We find it in our salt. That was one of the big areas that you're going to find that. And we don't really see issues with this because we have it in our salt, and that's going to be iodine. All right, so no, iodine is important for the thyroid hormone. In fact, if you were paying attention in the lecture, notice I bring up stimulates iodine absorption. That's because it's important. All right. Lack of iodine, what that can lead to. Some of you might know this, especially if you took the general bio course at where I teach. If you did, we of course know that we're talking a goiter. That was brought up early in general biology, talking about the importance of iodine. And all a goiter is, it's an enlargement of your thyroid gland. And the reason that enlargement happens is you can't form the thyroid hormone. So remember those follicles that are like little pouches? They start to swell because they're not actually finishing the process of forming thyroid hormone. And so since they don't form it, they swell. And we're going to explain that later. All right, but thyroid hormone that has 3 iodine ions is called T3 or triiodothyronine. Like I said, that's usually extra credit if I ask you to write out the full name. And then T4 is thyroxine, and that just simply means it has 4 iodine. We're not going to single out how they're different besides the fact that they just have 1 extra iodine when it goes from T3 to T4. Other than that, it's really just, I write on the exam when I talk thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. So you don't need to get too caught up on these names here. All right, but as far as thyroid hormone goes, you should know what it ultimately does is it increases metabolic activity. In that previous table, I forgot to mention that previous table. I didn't have anywhere to put what table number. That's table 18.3, just so you know. But thyroid hormone increases metabolic activity, and the way it does so is it actually elevates oxygen and energy consumption. Overall, we know if we're using energy, right, one of the byproducts of using ATP is heat as a kind of byproduct. Well, that's what's going to cause the raising of body temperature. And if you notice, increases energy utilization, oxygen consumption, growth, and development. So basically all these things are doing that. Increases heart rate and force of contractions, i.e. increasing distribution. All right, so we know sympathetic activity is often associated with increased activity. Well, that means increased breathing rate, increased heart rate, etc. Increases sensitivity to sympathetic stimulation. Again, sympathetic stimulation is related to increased heart rate, increased breathing rate. Stimulates red blood cell formation. Notice, all about oxygen delivery. Stimulates other endocrine organs. We're not going to focus too much on that, but this really works in conjunction with epinephrine, norepinephrine. If you didn't have thyroid hormone, epinephrine, norepinephrine wouldn't function properly. All right, accelerates turnover of minerals and bones. Again, this isn't an area that we focus too much on. We're actually going to focus on something called calcitonin, where we're going to talk about that. So we'll get to this point, but these last 2 points aren't so important. The main thing is if you look at these top 4, notice those top 4 points are really related to what's mentioned here and really are the main points of how thyroid hormone functions. But again, stick to the big picture, which are really these 3 points. Those are the 3 main points. How do we increase energy utilization? Well, we deliver oxygen, elevate oxygen supplies, deliver it faster, increase the number of red blood cells. Notice that's all about oxygen right there. And so overall, we say that the thyroid hormone has a calorigenic effect, and all that simply means is it consumes energy. And there you see the word calorie. I am big into prefix and suffix here, and here we have the prefix. That's the beginning of the word. Calorie here, or calorigenic, it's telling you it consumes calories to release heat. So you should be able to recognize a term like that. All right, but overall, the main point here was to go through this and really understand some of the histology here and give you kind of a nice overview as to how TSH, T3, and TRH, TSH, and T3 and T4, how are they interrelated? How do they kind of function together? And then we, of course, went over some of the key histology. So that really covered a key intro here. When we move on to the second part, that's where we're going to get into a little bit more complicated components. All right, but thank you all for listening. I hope to see you at the second part. That's where we'll get into the formation and more of a sort of like a physiological side of this lecture. Take care, everyone. I'll see you later.